The crowd was electric, the kind of wild you only get under a Texas sun and a sky wide enough to swallow a man whole. Dust kicked up with every stomp inside the arena, but the noise died down the moment the announcer called his name. Cal Hunter, 56, stood by the gate, his square jaw tight, his silver-streaked hair tucked beneath a worn-out cowboy hat. His flannel shirt clung to his back, sweat already bleeding through. But his eyes, steely blue and hollowed by time, were calm. Too calm. He lowered himself onto the back of the beast they called Black Thorn, a spotted bull with fire in its muscles and death in its eyes. Every scar on Cal's weathered face seemed to twitch as the bull shifted under him, snorting like a storm waiting to break. He wrapped his hand in the rope, gave a quick nod to the gateman, and breathed once, deep. The chute slammed open, and the bull exploded out like a cannon. The first buck launched Cal into the air an inch. The second snapped his spine sideways. For 5 seconds, he held. The sixth broke him. Black Thorn twisted hard, a savage corkscrew that no one could have predicted. Cal's body lifted clean off the animal, airborne, limp, his hat sailing separately like a falling leaf. The ground hit him like a sledgehammer. And then silence. Dust lingered around his motionless frame. Medics rushed in. The rodeo clowns distracted the bull. Fans stood frozen. And Cal just laid there, his vest cracked, ribs crushed beneath it. But then, slowly, his chest rose, a shallow breath, then another. And then his eyes opened. One of the medics leaned in close. Cal's lips barely moved, but the words were unmistakable. James ... he knew. The medic blinked. What did you say? Cal's eyes locked onto the blue sky above him. Again, he whispered, James. I saw him. He knew. The name fell like a brick. Who the hell is James? Someone behind the rail asked, but no one answered. All around the arena, whispers spread like fire on dry grass. Cal hadn't spoken that name in over 30 years, not since the last time he rode in this very arena. The day something terrible happened, something buried deep in the soil of this town, something only a few men remembered. And now, in front of hundreds of strangers, Cal had said the one name he swore he never would again. And that's when everyone knew this wasn't just a fall. This was the beginning of something that would tear the past wide open. Back in the medic tent behind the arena, the crowd's cheers had long faded into quiet murmurs. Cal lay on a stretcher, a fresh cut bleeding near his temple, one leg bent unnaturally, his chest rising with painful effort. But the wound that mattered most wasn't visible. Not to the EMTs, not even to the worried rodeo officials outside. The flaps of the tent. It was in his eyes, haunted, confused, like he'd just seen a ghost. Buck Red Jennings barged through the flap, pushing past a young paramedic. Move, I've known this man 30 years, he barked. The wrinkles around his eyes crinkled with worry as he knelt beside his old friend. Cal, you said James. You sure about that? Cal didn't speak, just turned his head slowly and looked straight at Buck. The silence was thicker than blood. Buck leaned in closer, voice low. Tell me you didn't see him. Cal closed his eyes and whispered. He was there, Red, right behind the gate. Same look in his eyes, like the day he disappeared. Buck went pale. The tent seemed to lose its air. James Whitlow had been gone for over 3 decades after the incident. No one dared to talk about anymore. The last time that name was spoken out loud was at a funeral with no body and too many lies. Outside the tent, the whispers were spreading like wildfire. Younger riders, like Travis Boone, barely knew the name. But the older ones? The ones with gray in their beards and fear in their eyes? They remembered. And they didn't want to. Sheriff Wallace Dean had already gotten word and was seen walking toward the medic tent, boots kicking up dust with every heavy step. Emily Hunter, Cal's estranged daughter, arrived moments later. She hadn't seen her father in over 5 years, and the call she received said he'd been thrown nothing more. Seeing him now, battered and mumbling names from a past she'd been kept out of, her anger began to mix with something else, fear. "Dad, what are you talking about? Who's James?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Cal didn't answer. His fingers twitched, gripping her hand for the first time in years, and in that moment, just a flicker, something shifted in Emily's eyes, a memory, a voice from her childhood. A name whispered once in her sleep by her father, when he thought no one could hear. James. A name she was told never to ask about. Now, here it was again dragged back into the light, and it wasn't. Going away this time, Sheriff Wallace Dean stood just outside the medic tent, arms crossed, jaw tight. His gray mustache twitched each time someone muttered the name James. He hadn't heard that name in years, not since the investigation that never reached the newspapers. Now, hearing it again, after all this time, after Cal's fall, it made his gut twist in ways that no badge could protect him from. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Cal," Wallace said, removing his hat out of respect. "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw." Cal's eyes drifted open slowly. He was standing behind the gate, not older, not younger, just the same. Wallace glanced at Buck, then at Emily. "James Whitlow's been dead for 34 years, he said flatly. "Well, gone. Either way, he ain't coming back." Cal shook his head. "I know what I saw, Sheriff. You can believe me or not, but I saw him." Emily's heart pounded. Her father hadn't spoken this much to her in years, and now every word was wrapped in mystery. She turned to Buck. "Who was James?" Buck looked down, his boots dusty, hands on his knees. "He was Cal's best friend. Back before you were born. They rode together, grew up together, laughed, fought, everything, until that night, the night of the lightning storm." Emily's face twisted. "What storm?" Buck exhaled. Late summer 1991, Rodeo in Abilene. Cal and James had words after a ride. Nobody knew what about, but they both left angry. Hours later, James's truck was found abandoned by the river. Blood on the door. Wallet still on the seat, but no body. Sheriff Dean chimed in, voice low. "We searched every inch of that river. Dogs, divers, nothing." Cal said he hadn't seen James after the rodeo, and nothing ever proved otherwise. "And no one said his name since?" Emily asked, stunned. Not out loud, Buck said, "Because around here, when someone vanishes like that, folks don't stir the dirt unless they're ready for what's underneath." Outside, Travis Boone stood at the gate where Cal had pointed. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something felt off. The dust hadn't settled. The boards felt colder than they should. And when he looked toward the crowd, he saw a man in a brown felt hat, standing alone by the fence, arms crossed. Face unreadable dot when Travis blinked. The man was gone. That evening, the arena sat quiet. The rodeo lights still hummed, but the dirt floor was empty. Spectators had gone home, but a chill lingered in the stands. In the locker room behind the chutes, Buck Red Jennings sat on an old wooden bench, holding a box that hadn't been touched in over 30 years. He'd kept it locked in the back of his trailer all this time, just in case Cal ever asked for it. But Cal never did. Buck hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded bandana, were worn photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and one letter folded and torn at the edges. He pulled out a photo first. It showed Cal and James, both young, both beaming with dust on their faces and pride in their posture, standing beside a bull they both conquered. Buck stared at the photo, his throat tight. James had a face you didn't forget, sharp eyes, a scar near his eyebrow, and a calmness that made people trust him. But it was the letter that mattered now. Buck unfolded it slowly. He'd read it only once before, the night James disappeared. It was addressed to Cal. The handwriting was rushed, like James had written it in a panic. If anything happens tonight, don't believe what they say. I didn't run. You know me better than that. I had no choice. The rest was smeared, water damaged. But one line still stood out, underlined twice. They know about us, about the deal. Buck's hands shook slightly as he refolded the paper. Whatever deal James had written about, it had never come to light. Cal had never mentioned it, and no one dared to dig deeper back then. But now, with Cal claiming to have seen James and that strange moment at the gate, Buck knew the past wasn't buried like they thought. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat on her father's porch, staring out into the Texas dusk. Cal was inside, sedated, resting after his injuries. She held her phone in her lap, screen lit with a Google search. James Whitlow, Abilene disappearance. The articles were vague. No official foul play, no charges. Just a missing man and a trail gone cold. But something in her gut told her. The truth was never written in those reports dot behind her. The old screen door creaked. Cal's voice, weak but clear, slipped through the silence. He didn't just vanish, Emily. He was taken. She turned slowly, eyes wide. By who? Cal stared past her, out into the fading light. I think you already know the name. The next morning, the air was unusually still around the rodeo grounds. Travis Boone returned early, before sunrise, unable to shake what he'd seen or thought he'd seen the day before. The man in the felt hat. The one standing by the fence. Travis had asked around, even checked the guest sign-ins. No one had seen anyone matching the description. No stranger. No visitor. Just locals and crew. But Travis knew what he saw. And something about that man's eyes felt like they'd seen too much. Back at Cal's house, Emily sat at the kitchen. Table with Buck. The letter was on the table between them, along with the old photograph of Cal and James. Emily traced the handwriting with her fingers, rereading the line over and over again. They know about us, about the deal. What deal? She asked, finally. Buck looked away. It was a land deal, he said after a pause, between Cal, James, and Luke McCready. They were going to buy a stretch of property east of town. Prime rodeo training land. Luke? Emily narrowed her eyes. The guy who runs the rodeo company now? Buck nodded slowly. Back then, he was just a promoter. Ambitious. Greedy. Something happened before the sale closed. James wanted out. Cal said it got ugly. Then, James vanished. Emily's breath caught. You think Luke had something to do with it? Buck leaned back in the chair. I don't think. I know he did. But we couldn't prove a damn thing. Emily grabbed her keys. Then it's time we talked to Luke. An hour later, they stood in Luke McCready's office at the rodeo complex. The man hadn't aged well, his frame thicker, hair thinner, but his smile just as fake as ever. You're barking up the wrong tree, he said, flipping a silver coin between his fingers. James was a drunk. He ran off. Happens all the time in this business. Cal, weak but determined, had insisted on coming too. He stepped forward, bruised, but burning with anger. You lied to everyone, he said. You told them James was unstable. You made them doubt him. Luke's smile faded. You don't want to go digging, Cal. You've lived a quiet life for a reason. His voice lowered. You start pulling on threads, and people you care about might unravel with it. That's when the door behind them creaked open. A familiar voice calm. Southern, unmistakably real spoke from the hallway. I told you I'd come back for the truth. Everyone turned, and standing in the doorway was James Whitlow. A long moment, no one moved. The room stood frozen, Cal. Emily, Buck, and Luke McCready staring at the man in the doorway as if death itself had walked in. James Whitlow looked almost exactly as he had in that old photograph. His dark brown felt hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but the unmistakable scar near his right eyebrow was all the confirmation Cal needed. His voice had the same slow southern drawl, and his presence quiet, intense, carried the weight of decades. Luke took one step back, jaw slightly open. "This can't be real," he muttered. "You're dead." James didn't blink. "No, Luke, you just needed me to be." Emily's hand instinctively reached for Cal's arm. He was shaking more from emotion than pain. "How?" Cal finally asked. "Why now?" James stepped further into the office, eyes never leaving Luke. "Because it took 34 years for someone to say my name out loud. That's how. Long it took for the truth to matter again." Buck stepped forward, voice trembling. "Where have you been, James? We buried you in our minds a long time ago." James glanced at him, a trace of softness in his expression. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. The night of the storm, I was supposed to meet someone. Someone who promised to make things right with the land deal. Instead, I walked into a trap." He turned back to Luke. "Tell them what you did." Luke scoffed, trying to regain control. "You think anyone's gonna believe a ghost story from a man who disappeared without a word?" James stepped closer. "You lured me out there. You threatened me. When I wouldn't sign over my share, your men came at me. I fought. Got away. Barely. I've been hiding ever since. Watching. Waiting." Emily's voice cracked. "You've been alive this whole time? Why didn't you come back?" James looked at her, then at Cal. "Because if I did, they would have buried me for real." Cal lowered his head, the weight of guilt and lost years crushing his chest. "I believed them, James. I didn't fight hard enough to find you." James placed a hand on Cal's shoulder. "You were scared." "So was I, but we're not running anymore." He turned once again to Luke. "You used our silence. But that ends now." Outside, a rumble of tires echoed across the gravel lot. Sheriff Wallace Dean had arrived with backup. Sheriff Wallace Dean stepped into the office, eyes scanning the room like a man already sensing trouble. Behind him, 2 deputies lingered at the doorway. The sheriff had known Cal, Luke, and James since they were teenagers. And now, standing face to face with the man he once declared missing, maybe even presumed dead, his breath caught for just a moment. "James Whitlow," he said slowly. "Either I'm losing my mind, or we've got a whole lot to talk about." James gave a faint nod. "I never stopped existing, Sheriff. I just stopped being seen." Wallace approached cautiously. "You look good for a dead man. Mind telling me where the hell you've been hiding for 3 decades? James looked over at Cal. Safe places. Out of reach. Watching Luke get rich off the land he tried to steal. Watching Cal ride again, broken by the guilt. I waited for the right time, and it finally came. Luke's usual confidence began to crack. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You expect anyone to believe this fantasy? You're a coward who ran when things got tough. You left your friends and vanished." Cal stepped forward, his face hard. "No, Luke, you tried to erase him. You tried to scare him silent, and when that didn't work, you disappeared him. You almost did the same to me, all over again." Luke's fists clenched. "You have no proof." Sheriff Dean turned toward James. "He's right. I need something. Words won't be enough. Not after 34 years. James reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope yellowed brittle and sealed with a stamp long out of circulation. "It's all in here," he said. "Signed papers, canceled checks, and a written threat I kept all these years. Luke's handwriting. Dated the night I disappeared." He handed it to the sheriff. Wallace took the envelope without a word. Emily looked at her father. What happens now? Cal's voice was low. That land destroyed all of us. Friendships, trust, my life. Yours, but maybe, just maybe, it can give us a chance to set things right. The sheriff nodded toward his deputies. Take Mr. McCready into custody. We'll sort this out properly. Luke didn't fight. He just stared at James with a mix of hatred and fear. You should have stayed gone, he muttered. James didn't flinch. I almost did. As Luke was led out in handcuffs, Buck stood silently by the window. Outside, the arena lights blinked in the distance, and for the first time in decades, the ghost had stopped whispering. The news of Luke McCready's arrest spread fast across town. By sundown, every ranch, diner, and gas station was buzzing with whispers. Folks who once praised Luke for his success were now remembering the rumors they had chosen to forget. But inside Cal's house, the real storm was happening in silence. Cal sat at the edge of his bed, shoulders hunched, staring down at his boots. He hadn't said much since Luke was taken away. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, still trying to piece together who her father really was. You knew something was wrong back then, she said quietly. Why didn't you do anything? Cal looked up slowly. His face looked older than it had just a few days ago. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid if I dug too deep, I'd find out I was part of it. Emily stepped inside, her voice tight. And what about me? You shut me out my whole life, Dad. You never told me about James. Never told me anything. Cal's eyes welled, but he didn't wipe them. You were just a baby when it happened. And by the time you were old enough to ask questions, I was already buried in silence. I didn't know how to bring any of it back up. Without losing you too. She sat beside him, a long pause settling between them. Then, you already did lose me, you know? Cal nodded. I know. And that's on me. He looked down at his hands, still rough, still scarred. But if there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that the truth always finds its way back. Doesn't matter how long it takes. Or how far you run. Outside, James Whitlow stood on the porch, staring out over the empty rodeo grounds. Buck joined him, holding 2 cups of black coffee. You sure you want to stick around? Buck asked. James took a sip, eyes fixed on the arena. I didn't come back to disappear again, he said. There's still pieces to pick up. Not just with Cal, with everyone. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were, but I owe this town some answers. Behind them, the screen door creaked open. Cal stepped outside, slowly, leaning against the frame. James turned. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, with quiet gravity, Cal said, I should have fought for you. James nodded, his voice steady. Then fight for what's left. And just like that, the healing began. The following day brought a soft, golden sunrise over the arena, the kind that felt like a clean slate. Behind, for the first time in over 3 decades, James, Cal, and Buck stood together inside the empty ring boots, sinking slightly in the loose dirt. Silence between them thick with everything that hadn't been said. The stands were empty, but the weight of memory filled every row. It was the same arena where they'd once dreamed big. And lost everything. Cal ran his hand along the rail. You remember the day we promised we'd go pro together? He asked, a faint smile touching his lips. I remember, James said, his voice steady. You were always the brave one. I was the one with too many questions. Buck chuckled. And I was just happy not to get trampled. The laughter faded as quickly as it came, giving way to a moment of reflection. We never took that ride, did we? Cal added. James shook his head. No, life took a different turn. Meanwhile, back at Cal's house, Emily stood by the window, watching them from afar. Her heart was a mix of relief and confusion. She had spent years building walls around her pain, only to find that the foundation had been built on half-truths. Now, with her father opening up, the past didn't seem so distant. It felt alive, raw, and begging to be understood. She walked out to the arena, boots crunching the gravel as she approached. The three men looked up as she entered. "I think I need to know everything," she said. "Not just about James. About you, Dad. About who you really are." Cal met her gaze, his eyes no longer hiding. "Then stay. Hear it from all of us." James gave a small nod. "You deserve that much." The four of them sat on the arena fence, the sun warming their backs, as James began to recount it all. The land deal, the threats, the fear, and the moment he realized disappearing was the only way to survive. Emily listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears. Cal added pieces he had buried for years, how guilt turned to silence, how silence became distance, and how that distance stole his family away. By the end, nothing had been magically fixed. The pain was still there, but now it had a name, a shape, and a shared space among them. Sometimes healing doesn't come with answers, it comes with truth, and someone finally being brave enough to speak it. A week later, the rodeo grounds came alive once again, but this time it wasn't for competition. The crowd wasn't there to see riders get thrown or bulls buck high into the air. They came for something else, something heavier. A tribute ride. One final lap in the dirt, not for points or trophies, but for closure. And Cal Hunter, bruised ribs and all, had insisted on doing it himself. He stood behind the gate, hat in hand, eyes on the open arena. James, standing beside him, gave a quiet nod. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. Cal smiled softly. "It's not about proving. It's about letting go." Nearby, Emily watched from the rails with Buck, both silent as the sun dipped low. There was a hush across the arena, the kind of silence that only comes when something sacred is about to happen. The chute opened. The bull wasn't one of the monsters, just a steady old steer borrowed from a nearby ranch. Cal rode with grace, not fury. His hands stayed firm, his body loose. For 8 seconds, he looked like the man he used to be. But more importantly, he looked like a man who had finally made peace with everything that had broken him. When the ride ended, he dismounted and stood tall in the center of the ring, chest rising and falling, the crowd on their feet in applause, not for a score, but for a life reclaimed. Later that night, under a sky full of stars, they sat around a small fire behind Cal's house, just the four of them. James sipped his coffee. Emily leaned against her father's shoulder. Buck told a story from their younger days, and for the first time in decades, laughter replaced the old silence. James looked at Cal. "You think folks will believe the truth now?" Cal looked at the fire, then at his daughter. "Maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't matter anymore. We believed it. We faced it. That's enough." As the fire crackled and the crickets sang in the grass, Emily took her father's hand. It was rough and calloused, but warm. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Cal blinked back a tear. "Took me long enough to give you something to be proud of." They sat that way for a long while. No more hiding. No more ghosts. Just family and the sound of healing under a quiet Texas sky.